I first would like to say thank you to all of the presenters who have gone so far. These have been just wonderful papers. So one of my earliest social dance memories is being swept off my feet, literally, by a rabbi. I was 12 or 13 years old at a bar mitzvah with my secular Jewish family, and this presumably non-Orthodox rabbi, who must have seen me rocking out on the dance floor, scooped me up and twirled me around the room in a spirited merengue. That dance was native to Haiti and the Dominican Republic, but typical band fare in the mid-60s at the New York City bar mitzvah receptions following the religious rites. I knew none of the steps to the merengue then or now. What I remember is the feeling of the dance and my partner taking me into a wild ride of spatial disorientation, speed, and abandon. Partnered social dance was new to me as an experience, but not as a phenomenon. My talk centers on memories of a recurring event or variations of it, as it has been replayed in my memories of childhood and early adolescence. My parents, Jerry and Phyllis Satin, dancing, the Lindy, the foxtrot, and above all, the twist, as I watched with others at weddings, bar mitzvahs, other social occasions. I remember how they moved, and especially how they looked at each other. My mother's smile was sexy and secretive. My father's was flirtatious and daring. It was thrilling, illicit, a spectacle hovering over boundaries of public and private, inclusion and exclusion. I remember my sister and me literally jumping up and down with glee, with pride in our beautiful parents and their collectively acknowledged specialness, probably with some anxiety at not being in the dance with them, and presumably with tinglings of intense and inchoate excitation. As a dancer and writer, I'm drawn to autobiography as it figures in movement and language, in performance, fiction, history, and critical lens. Today, considering my parents' stories, or my stories of my parents, I'm looking at overlaps and exchanges of personal, cultural, and mediated memories, at individual narratives embedded in collective circumstances and beliefs, at embodied and textual memories, weaving corporeal knowledge through ever-changing retellings of family stories, at the charged repetition of memories into my own choreography and dancing. So I invite you now to remember my parents dancing, to imagine them through my words. A scrim covers the memories I'm conjuring, recent images veiling older, more perfect ones. I can't help but see my father, who died in 2013, as he was in his last months after a 12-year struggle with Parkinson's. Sorry. Always big, graceful, and handsome, he was slowly deserted by even his senses and, of course, his muscle control. My mother, in her 80s, acts and looks much younger. Having survived one serious illness and living with another, she's social, moderately active, politically aware. She is re-narrativizing her life, shuffling the pages of her autobiography and writing new ones, just as she continually redecorates her first own apartment and, newly media-wise, texts the daily results. But back in the floating then of my imagination, she was in her 20s or early 30s. Her dark hair poofed or piled up in some fancy do, her shoes high-heeled, her body slim and curvy under a green satin sheath dress or tight bodice and full skirt. My father was dressed up too, and his gliding entry onto the dance floor with my mother had the feel of a strut. Slipping into his tuxedo, he slipped into character too. Suave, debonair, gentlemanly. He was a wonderful dancer, who I later discovered could touch the small of your back ever so slightly and mysteriously guide you through steps and patterns you didn't think you knew. My parents held the floor with their clarity and assurance, invisibly led by my father in the steps, turns, and dips of the ballroom numbers. And shifting into the more improvisational twist, they held each other with their torsos and their eyes. They didn't directly face each other, but stood a sidestep apart, so their bodies were parallel but not lined up. Their movement was more suggestive than salacious, hips sliding side to side above their shifts of weight, arms softly sawing along with the hips' rhythm. Gaze to gaze, they turned their heads toward each other. My mother often let the tips of her tongue stick out to one side just a little, even brush her lips. This is what she looked like.
Do you look like your mother?
My father always had what my mother calls a slight wink when he danced, a little ironic, proud, possessive. It is challenging for me to channel him, crossing lines of size and gender, talking myself into his twinkle. So this, sort of, is what he looked like. Memory in dance, of course, is joined with embodiment, merging muscle memory, spatial and kinesthetic awareness, sensory perception, as it figures in our dancing and remembering experiences. Much writing on memory focuses solely or predominantly on the mind, rather than stressing the significance of the mnemonic body. Conversely, some dancers wish to compartmentalize the body and mind rather than integrate them or recognize what choreographer Susan Redhorst calls the body's mind. They, or we, choose to see the body as autonomous and unmediated, offering direct links to memory, presentness, timelessness. A recent conference on Jews and Jewishness in the dance world exemplified in both talks and movement workshops 2 through lines regarding memory. We experience our collective as well as individual history at the body level, and we experience and reproduce even those aspects of history that precede our own lives. Scientific and sociological evidence substantiates this, from the writings of neuroscientists to sociologist Marcel Maus's 1935 analysis of technique. Ballet or walking, these learned, remembered ways of doing things carry out cultural conventions through ongoing embodied processes of memory into present. And dances, dance memoirs, and scholarship have long assumed our potential for blood memory. In this instance, the primary example was the Holocaust. It suffused so many of our experiences, almost an answer to Primo Levi's question, the title of dance historian Marianne Kant's keynote speech. Then, in what sense are you Jewish? It struck me that not only have we heard ad infinitum about this sweeping genocide from survivors and observers, we have come to know it through the repetition of photographic and cinematic images that simultaneously remind us, threaten us, and resituate us as insiders. We know the Holocaust from movies like Jean-Pierre Melville's 1969 Army of Shadows, Alain René's 1956 Night and Fog, Laszlo Nemesh's 2015 Son of Saul, Pavel Pawlikowski's 2013 Ida, from the thousands of photographs of cadaverous inmates in striped uniforms, from the rooms of talking head videos at Yad Vashem, elderly survivors recounting unbearable losses hammered into language. I'm haunted by the posture of one man, the dreadfulness of his memories at odds with the shy tilt of his head. Poet Joan Logie points out in her blog, following the fatal October 2018 attack on a Pittsburgh synagogue, that she knew the Holocaust primarily through Anne Frank, and we know Frank not only through her writing, but through her story's multi-channel repetition, her mediated celebrity. This Holocaust history as mediated memory was, I think, a significant factor in those parties my family and their friends attended then, not all that many years since the end of the war. The festivities would have been opportunities for joy and celebration at any time, but many of these celebrants, these Jewish dancers, were still working through and moving through this enormous narrative frame. We know that the glut of imagery, like those terrible photographs, can overwhelm us to the point of distance, even boredom. We also know that the repetition of an image can recharge or trigger the initial sensation. Today's more positive digital photo archives have their own implications, not only for the possibilities of constructing a life or its record, but for how we integrate our memories. The canopy of the Holocaust and other collective traumas merges with personal photo archives, Instagram updates, and our expanding options of media, and thus mediated memory, as contributors to our auto-narratives. I offer here a brief overview of these ways of knowing. In her 2007 Mediated Memory in the Digital Age, new media scholar José van Dijk theorizes our personal shoeboxes, which we now see as containing digital as well as analog information, the images and ideas hovering in the cloud, and the familiar accumulation of tangible ephemera. For Van Dijk, mediated memories are both the stuff in the box and a mental concept that pointedly encompasses aspects of mind and body as well as of technology and culture. How we accumulate the material and impalpable components of our self in the making is integral to our sense of that self. Van Dijk notes that our masses of digital photographs raise poignant concerns about the relation between material objects and autobiographical memory, between media technologies and our habits and rituals of remembrance. The analog digital shoebox calls up a much older image, the intensely personal, profoundly pre-digital variation on the treasured keepsakes tenderly described by phenomenologist Gaston Bachelard in his 1958 Poetics of Space. Bachelard's focus isn't even on the stuff itself, but on the box, even better, the closed box, whose perhaps forever hidden contents suggest the intimacy and secrecy with which we might experience and reimagine our past and continuing lives. The fluidity or continuous process of fictionalizing with which we recompose our life stories, and a quite outmoded concept of privacy regarding personal matters. Sociologist Rafael Narvaez's idea of embodied collective memory is a social structure that results from the transubstantiation of history in people. It emphasizes the body's role in memory, the gestures, corporeal and phonetic rhythms, common affective idioms, and emotional styles largely learned in a social context. That context is interwoven with biology. Neuroscience demonstrates that we're hardwired for empathy, imitation, intersubjectivity, and a sense of self. Neuroscientist Marco Iacoboni's claim of our instinct to synchronize our bodies echoes dancer phenomenologist Susan Kozel's observation that moving with others, experiencing them in ourselves, we're embodied through other bodies. Moreover, our embodied inheritance, which is ideologically and politically as well as personally charged, is malleable, redefining itself as it continues into the future, allowing for the embodied evolution of behaviors and beliefs. Autobiography, too, evolves. typically considered an excavation of one's individual past brought into the present through retrospection, it increasingly acknowledges the formation of the self in social circumstances, recognizing people as social actors expressing collective ways of being. In 1980, anthropologist Barbara Meyerhoff defined events like the weddings and bar mitzvahs where my parents danced as definitional ceremonies in which people performed their collective identity. My parents understood that stepping out as embedded in broad customs of cultural choreography, not only the celebratory hora danced at every group affair, but the unwritten checklist of rules and details linking the guests and the host family to upward mobility and community stature. Memory is dynamic, layered, altered, complicated by collective and personal contributions. We overlap, lose, and reposition the images, affects, and movements of our past, present, and imagined futures. I remember something, a plot, a sensation, with certainty, but I'm not sure whether it happened to me or I saw it in a movie or read it in a novel. Choreographing C'est-à-dire, whose title suggests the restating or clarifying of something not quite right, I inserted little inventions of movie scenes, reinventions of movie scenes. One, it turned out, based on a clearly but wrongly remembered character in François Truffaut's 1962 film, Jules and Jim. We often see our lives in cinematic terms. A movie that deftly illuminates the interplay of autobiography with mediated memory is Hirokazu Koreeda's 1998 Afterlife, in which a disparate group of people who have recently died are gathered in a sort of purgatorial way station. Each person is asked to remember his or her life, then choose a favorite scene to take to the afterlife. If need be, the process is facilitated by giving the person a set of videotapes of that life. For some, it is simple enough to pluck from now filmic memories a place, a moment, a feeling. For others, it is no easy task. Eventually, the counselors recreate the chosen scene in a demonstrably low-tech film, and then the subject disappears, liberated to eternity. We see our lives and their photo-videographic representations in terms of greatest hits. Photographer Jo Spence wrote of coming to see her portraits as collusions with the subject to produce visual myths devoid of the endless intrusions into our idealized versions of ourselves. She, instead, documented what most albums omit, including her own dying. Photographic images of my parents merge with and depart from my and their memories. In a later shot, posing before a party, they look, we all agree, like stars. Elizabeth Taylor and Hal Holbrook. This is no accident. As Spence wrote, the subject of a photograph participates in his or her staging. Literary theorist Roland Barthes, too, describes transforming himself into an image. The more or less conscious control of one's image in the world, now and forever, is performed through individual and repeated images situating the subject within composed environments and moments. For my parents and countless others, there are wedding portraits and other pictures whose arm around each other postures or eyelids lowered serenity idealize them as a happy couple. There are many relaxed pictures of family fun in the country, at the beach, on vacation. There are no pictures of my father working 3 jobs at once, or my mother managing the everyday tumult of 3 young children and later a job in New York City. Social dancing and vacations were separate from the parts of their lives defined by labor and obligation, more likely to be recalled and replayed, and to play out the malleability of autobiography. Here, appropriating moments of my parents' lives, their moving bodies in the service of my own telling, I'm reminded that the mental images I carry of my parents are mine, not theirs. In my first dancing memory, I'm standing on the tops of my father's feet, being gently introduced to the rules of the game, wordplay on film history, social dance's ludic aspects, and broadly speaking, the social construction of reality. I remember seeing my parents dance in the living room, doing what they called homemade flamenco, but only because my mother has told me do I know how they went out dancing at the Copacabana, how she liked being watched dancing, how as a teenager, she and a girlfriend visited my father and his pals at their beach bungalow, all dolled up and very cool in the hot weather, but chastely staying in what they didn't realize was a Jewish hotel and scandalizing the guests by smoking on Shabbat. As I connect my memories of my parents dancing to photos, I link them to film, sometimes confusing them with films. Perhaps the most germane, as the undermining of the ideal religious, cultural, and personal right, is the hilariously catastrophic Jewish wedding in Damian Sifron's 2014 Wild Tales, an Argentinian black comedy of people behaving incredibly badly. This segment is an upheaval of the 1960s Jewish wedding classic, Goodbye Columbus, a considerably more decorous story of moneyed nuptial combustion. In Wild Tales, social dance instigates and stands in for premarital, marital, and extramarital sex, as the traditional first dance of the new couple is interrupted by acts of unlikely carnality and chaos. My favorite dance episode in a movie is the cafe scene in Jean-Luc Godard's 1964 Band of Outsiders. Notable for its kinetic verve and its 4-minute-long uncut cinematography. The film's three renegades do a cool, choreographed unison line dance, the Madison, standing close to each other, gazing down or ahead. Odile, in pleated skirt, sweater, and jaunty hat, stands between the two men. She smiles sweetly, a little nervously, seeming to enjoy herself. Michel Legrand's bouncy jazz plays on the jukebox. Occasionally, the music cuts out and we hear the dancers' stamps, claps, and finger snaps. Godard's voiceover interrupts to announce what's really happening. Arthur keeps looking at his feet, but he thinks about Odile's mouth. Odile is wondering whether the two boys noticed her two breasts. In 1964, my mother wasn't very familiar with either Godard or Anna Karina, who played Odile. As she points out, she didn't go to the movies much in those child-rearing days. But when I see the film, I can imagine my mother as she might have been had her life circumstances offered her the choice of being an adorable drifter rather than a post-war Jewish girl from Brooklyn, whose life has always been secular but insistently Jewish. When I do the dance, which I've learned, quite roughly, from watching the film, I feel as though I'm channeling both of these then gamines. This is what she might have looked like. I've borrowed that cafe scene of Godard many times, and not using the actual choreography, but going for its affect, the devil-may-care look layered over the self-conscious, erotic, distracted interiority. Doing the twist, or some unorthodox merging of it with the Madison, I always feel my mother, tongue and all, dancing with my father at long-ago definitional ceremonies. And to complicate the interplay, I dance not only with my actual partners, but with the actors I long recalled as being in Godard's dance, Alain Delon and Jean-Paul Belmondo, who turned out not to be in the film at all. Thank you.